You've probably heard the story of Lady Godiva. She was that woman who rode a horse naked, covered only by her long, long hair. But have you ever heard more than just that part? Do you know why she rode that horse naked, covered only by her hair? Do you know why the chocolates are named after her? Do you even know if she's a real person or just a legend? This is the Detangler. I'm Melinda, and I really think a lot about hair all the time. Not really so much how we take care of our hair or how we style our hair, but all of these stories, these legends, these ways that we humans think about hair and deal with hair and contradict ourselves and react to hair. So this is the Detangler. Thank you for listening. Let's talk about Lady Godiva. The basic story of Lady Godiva is not only that she was this naked lady on a horse who was covered only by her hair, but how she got there. She was married to Leofric, who was the Earl of Mercia. So he had power over a lot of people in England, and he was taxing them. They were overly burdened with it, couldn't handle it, and so Godiva asked him to reduce or eliminate those taxes. And she nagged him so much that eventually he said, "Fine, if you go and ride through town naked on horseback, I will eliminate those taxes." And she said, "Challenge accepted." And she rode her horse through town naked. And he was good on his word and got rid of the taxes. So that's the general story. This legend has evolved over time. Eventually, it involved Peeping Tom. Did you know Peeping Tom came from the story of Lady Godiva? I'll get to that. But first, let's answer the question of, was Lady Godiva real or just this story? Lady Godiva was a real person living throughout the 11th century. So she lived through a very interesting time in England, starting with a bunch of Viking raids, and then King Canute, who brought all of England together, and then Canute's illegitimate son, whose name was Harefoot, and I just wish it was hair like hare and not hair like rabbit, but I'll take it. And then we get Harold, and then another Harold, and the second Harold is the one who was eventually brought down by William the Conqueror. So 1066, we get the Battle of Hastings, and the Normans come and invade England, and Lady Godiva lived through all of that. And she's a real person. Her Anglo-Saxon name is Godifu, which means God-given, but Godiva is the Latinized version of it, which we know from the Doomsday Book, which is commissioned by William the Conqueror to basically survey the land and do an audit on all of the properties. That's what the Doomsday Book is. It has nothing to do with doom and gloom. It's just a survey. And so we know from the Doomsday Book that Lady Godiva owned property. She owned a lot. She was very wealthy. She owned basically all of Coventry, which was quite a small village at the time. In one of those early Viking raids, they destroyed a monastery in Coventry, and then she and Leofric rebuilt it. They commissioned this brand new monastery. So she was a big deal. She was not only just the wife of the Earl of Mercia, she was a property owner. And to be listed in the Doomsday Book meant that she was important. One of the few women of the Middle Ages who's known as a property owner, and a very generous one at that. She probably did have long hair. Women in the Middle Ages were depicted with very long hair. Typically, 1066 is a big year in history. It's really a dividing line. This is when the Battle of Hastings happened. Yeah, William the Conqueror beat Harold in the Battle of Hastings. And before that point, Britain is run mainly by the Anglo-Saxons, and they are dealing with a lot of Viking invasions. So this is what's happening, and then around 1066, everything changes. That's when the Normans come in, and this is, to put it in context, when the Doomsday Book is starting up. So Godiva is born right in the middle of all of that. She's born in 1066, falls right somewhere into her lifespan. It's not until nearly 200 years later, in 1235, that we get the first mention of when Godiva rode on the horse naked. So for time immemorial, up until roughly the end of the 11th century, women wore their hair in veils and some sort of a headdress. They covered their hair. So that's how women were looking for all that time. And then Along with the Norman invasion came a new kind of hairdo. Suddenly you start seeing women who are wearing their hair in these long, long braids. They're starting to have their hair not always be covered by a veil. It's just really beginning right here around the 11th century. So, really, Godiva, most of her life is with people wearing the veils. But they are starting to wear these long braids, so maybe if she's really fashionable, really hip to it, she's going to start wearing the long braids. But by the time that happens, she's already really quite old. 1066, she's already like maybe 70 years old, perhaps, at that point. She wouldn't be the Godiva that we're imagining, this beautiful young woman with flowing hair. She'd be more of an old crone on horseback. And then, when she actually gets written about, women are wearing their hair covered up again. They're in veils again. If they're looking back in history at like what would this person have been like, they're going to look back to right around here in history, and they're going to think she's going to have these long, long flowing locks that you can actually see. So, yeah, history to them would have looked like her, but really Godiva would have been much more likely to look like her. She may have been naked, but realistically, she wasn't naked on horseback at all. Realistically, this didn't happen. The first time we hear of this naked horseback ride is in the 13th century with Roger of Wendover. He wrote The Flowers of History. At first, in The Flowers of History, Roger of Wendover is just talking about what a big deal Leofric is, how important and powerful and generous and kind he was. Which makes sense. For centuries, Leofric gets more press than Godiva does. But then Roger of Wendover starts talking about how Godiva is this religious woman and she's really a big fan of the Virgin Mary, and that she starts appealing to Leofric to free the people of Coventry of the tax burden. He describes Godiva as nagging him so much that he just doesn't want to hear about it anymore. And then finally he says, "Mount your horse and ride naked before all the people through the market of town, from one end to the other, and on your return you shall have your request." On which Godiva replied, "But will you give me permission if I'm willing to do it?" "I will," said he. She does. She goes ahead and she lets down her tresses, and they cover her body like a veil, and she rides her horse attended by 2 knights, and nobody ever sees her except for her nice legs. And when she gets back, her husband, Leofric, is astonished, and he agrees to do what he promised. He frees the town of taxes. Why do you think they would have invented it at that time? Well, taxes were a lot different in the 11th century versus the 13th century. In the 11th century, it would have been kind of ad hoc. Things were really tumultuous at that time in the 11th century. As I mentioned, we go from Viking raids to King Canute to random other people and eventually to William the Conqueror. Things were less formally established. By the time we get to the 13th century, the Magna Carta is in place, the parliament is already being established, and so taxes are much more regularized. They're more normalized. And so the 13th century, the idea of having some sort of a hero against taxes is much more important than it would have been in the 11th century, where taxes were really ad hoc. Another reason why quite likely this didn't happen is because if Godiva is appealing to Leofric to stop this burden of taxes on the people, that just doesn't make sense. Godiva herself is the person who owned Coventry, so she's the one who would have been able to tax them or not. And then we get to the town itself. It wasn't much of one at that point. What we know from the Doomsday Book is that there were only like 60 or so households, so it would have been a short ride. So Roger of Wendover quite likely invented the story of Lady Godiva to appease feelings about taxation and bring a hero who loves the Virgin Mary and who can be this religious person who is self-sacrificing and just wants to help the people. After Roger of Wendover's initial story, other historians of England start adding to it. In the 14th century, we get Ranulph Higden's Polychronicon, where he adds that Leofric stopped all taxation except for on horses, which apparently was how it was in Coventry under King Edward I at the very beginning of the 14th century. In Grafton's Chronicle from the 16th century, we get detailed instructions that everyone in town was warned to stay inside with their windows shut so that no one saw Godiva. And then later in the 16th century, we get this painting by Adam van Noort. It's the earliest known painting of Lady Godiva. And if you look in the top right corner, you can see someone looking out their window. This is the origin of Peeping Tom. In the 17th century, the city of Coventry starts having an annual procession where they reenact Godiva's ride through town, and Peeping Tom is a salacious detail that gets everyone's juices flowing. So she sends out her people ahead of time to tell everyone not to look, but Peeping Tom does watch. And then in some accounts, Peeping Tom, his eyes are miraculously like falling out of his head, or in some accounts he dies. Mentions of Lady Godiva really start to take off. You can see how suddenly in 1650-ish, she goes from nowhere to be seen in books to suddenly growing in popularity. At first, they just give the basics of the account, like what we've heard from Roger of Wendover, but dramatized or in poetry, and always with elaborate direct quotes. But soon, they start really leaning into the Peeping Tom story. He's supposed to be Tom the Tailor, but in 1818, the Visitor's Guide to Coventry describes their Tom effigy more like a soldier. They describe him as a full-length oaken statue of a man in armor with a helmet on his head, greaves on his legs, and sandals on his feet. And then in 1821, the story is referred to as Peeping Tom of Coventry, and in 1833, we get a musical called Peeping Tom of Coventry. Lady Godiva gets second billing. Things really start to get interesting in the Victorian era, and I'm going to do a whole other video on it. But right now I'll just tell you that that's when Lord Tennyson comes out with a poem which really captures everyone's imagination. Different painters, different poets, different historians all start writing more and more about Lady Godiva. We get feminist discourse about Lady Godiva even back in the Victorian era. And then this continues into the 20th century. In the 1920s, that's when you get Godiva chocolates. By this point, Lady Godiva starts to be known more for her sensuality, more for her beauty, than for this self-sacrificing kind of sentiment. These Victorian poets and painters, they're depicting her as this young, beautiful woman with this flowing, gorgeous hair, who's both modest, covered by her hair, and yet brazen, riding her horse through town naked like that. Really captures the imagination, especially when you get to these kind of repressed Victorians. And the Victorian era, you know, we have a firm start and end date, but honestly, the remnants of it continue on well into the 20th century. I'd argue even through today. The modern era is really based in Victorian values. Legend has it that the founder of Godiva Chocolate, his wife had really long hair, and so she was nicknamed Lady Godiva. It made sense. Godiva was ubiquitous in 1926. Her popularity from the Victorian era just kept growing. There was a 1911 Godiva movie. In 1912, there was an opera based on the Godiva story that ran until the 1930s. This movie is from 1921. And so when Godiva named their business after her in 1926, Godiva strongly connoted sensuality, luxury, and desire. In the 1950s, we get a tool for nuclear research, which is uranium that's unclad. So it's naked. It's not wearing anything. So they named that Godiva. And then in the 1970s, we get Queen, we get Freddie Mercury singing about Lady Godiva. Racing by, passing by like Lady Godiva. And then in the 1990s, Godiva Chocolates really starts capturing the imagination. It becomes much of a bigger deal than it was earlier on. And that's really why we now all know of Godiva Chocolates more than anything else about the Godiva myth. Godiva is still all around us. Take a look at Beyoncé's last 2 album covers. She's a scantily clad woman on horseback. Sound familiar? She's referencing the whole Godiva myth. She's beautiful, she's sensuous, and she's also a hero who stands up for regular people. You know when Queen Bee is copping your look, you've hit the big time. So that takes us to the end of the Godiva story. She was a real person. There is this myth about her. The myth is so much more enduring than her true legacy. And I think that's because of this seduction and modesty, which, as people in Western culture, we really love that push pull between being seductive and beautiful and being modest and pious. Thank you so much for watching and listening. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. Let me know. This is the place, Godiva, in Covent Garden. It's not the place, of course, because Godiva Chocolates was started in Belgium, but it is the place near me. Godiva. Ooh. That was a massive strawberry. Okay, that was a massive strawberry. But I also got this free samples. I'm pretty sure I have chocolate all over my face, definitely all over my fingers, but ugh. Alright, we have here chocolate. Melty egg with speculoos. Tastes like hair flowing off a naked lady on horseback.